First, everybody here looks familiar to me, so that's always nice when I walk into a room of people that I'm already a little familiar with. For those of you who don't remember, my name is Laura Coleman, and back in April I was hired as the Training and Education Coordinator for Airmen to Freedom Initiative. So when Aaron asked if I would be able to talk with you this month about the issue of trafficking, I said, hey, that's what we do. So that's what we're here for today. Now, I also understand this could be a really heavy topic, and this could, for some people, can bring up a lot of emotions or a lot of memories. And I was just sharing with Mandy when I was home in July, and I shared on this issue for one of my own family members. It brought up a lot of new thoughts and concerns because the more we learn about this issue, the more that we recognize it within our own family as it has impacted us. And so this, as Mandy has always made it known, this is a very safe place, but we want to make sure that we keep you safe. And if there's something that gets really heavy or emotional for you, if you want to share with us, or if you feel like you need to step away for a minute, then that's perfectly fine to do. But I want this to be kind of our opportunity to dialogue and talk and ask questions. So it's not a, I'm going to stand up here and talk and you just have to sit and listen. If there's something that you want to share or interject at any point, please feel free to do that, okay? And I hope that all of my technology cooperates with me. One of the things that I love about working with Araminta is they try to take an approach on this issue as this is God's charge to us, is to recognize that this is an issue that breaks God's heart too. And so we approach it just like we are challenged in the book of Luke when he says, the Spirit of the Lord is on me because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. So we consider this issue of human trafficking, and specifically child sex trafficking, as an issue that breaks God's heart. And these are modern day slaves, but we are called as believers in Christ and the fulfillment that he can give to address this issue instead of just walking past it or not acknowledging it and doing what we can to make a difference. Okay? So when we talk about human trafficking itself is the buying and the selling of people. All right, and it's estimated that there are as many as 40 million slaves around the world today. So that is more slaves today than there was 150 years ago before slavery was abolished. And we would probably say, most people would probably say, oh no, slavery was abolished more than 150 years ago. But the reality of it is, today this is a criminal industry, whereas 150 years ago, before it was abolished, it was a legal thing that was happening. It didn't make it right, but it was happening legally. Today it's happening and it's a criminal industry, and we know it's the #2 criminal industry around the world. There's like one criminal industry that has higher profits than selling people. Do you have any idea what it would be?
Drugs.
Selling drugs. Yeah, you're right. And then the #3 is guns and weapons. All right. Now, about a year and a half ago, guns and weapons were in the #2 spot. But now the selling of people has moved into the #2 spot. And it's anticipated that over the next year, the selling and the trafficking of people will move into the #1 spot, because drugs and weapons and guns can be sold once, but people can be sold over and over and over again. So although we will say that you know, there are fewer people being sold for, well, for instance, there are different forms of human trafficking. There's labor trafficking, and the bulk of people that are caught up in human trafficking are being trafficked for labor. They're working in places where they're not getting paid, they're not being treated properly, they're working really, really long hours. They were lied to and coerced to get into these settings, and then they don't have a way to get out of them or protect themselves. And a lot of times we will see that with our immigrant population. They come here thinking, once I get to the United States, I'm going to be able to get a job. And then they're kind of held prisoner in these places and not paid for months at a time. And they don't know how to get help for themselves, because if they're not documented properly, they think, well, I'm just going to get deported if I go and report it anyway. And so the people that are trafficking them will use those things to keep them in prison really, whether they're being chained to a facility or not. they're being held back and they're in bondage because they feel like they don't have a choice. They don't have an option. So although we know worldwide the majority of human trafficking is in the form of labor trafficking, the bulk of the profits being made on human trafficking is through sex trafficking. So about $150 billion a year is the profits that they say that's being made on human trafficking. 150 billion with a B. And of that, about 99 billion is attributed to sex trafficking, even though it's much fewer people that are caught up in sex trafficking than in labor trafficking. But we know sex trafficking, it pays a lot higher. And so the profits for the people that are the traffickers are much, much higher. All right. So the reality of it is sex trafficking is, the difference between human trafficking and sex trafficking is human trafficking could be labor. It could be child soldiers in some part of the world. It could be organ trafficking, where they will take people and steal their organs right out of them in order to sell them. But then sex trafficking is when people are sold for a commercial sex act. Now when we say commercial sex act, does anybody know what that means when it said the word commercial stuck on there? Commercial just means that there's an exchange of money between two people, or money or something of value, all right, in exchange for that sex act. So it could be that it could be that somebody is paying money. It could be that somebody is giving someone a place to stay. It could be that there's an exchange of drugs in order to, for somebody once they've accomplished that sex act. So anytime there's an exchange of something of value as a result of a sex act, that's what makes it commercial. All right. And in the year 2000, this became a federal crime in the United States when they passed the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. Now, when we talk specifically about child sex trafficking or domestic child sex trafficking, domestic just meaning within the United States. All right, we know child sex trafficking happens all over the world. Most people will say, yes, it happens in Greece, it happens in Thailand, it happens in Cambodia. We're going to talk today, in the time that we have, about how much it happens not only in the United States, but right here in Maryland. All right, some of the things you can look for, some of the ways that you can protect yourself, protect the people that you care about, protect your children or the young people that you know. So when we talk about domestic child sex trafficking, it's the commercial sexual exploitation of American children within the U.S. borders. All right. So when that word exploitation, anytime someone is being used against their will for someone else to profit on it, they're being exploited. All right. So labor trafficking is exploiting a person through their hard work and their energy and their efforts, and they're exhausting them physically working in a kitchen or working on construction projects and never paying them. That's exploiting someone. Sexual exploitation is exploiting someone through things like stripping, pornography, and prostitution, where the traffickers are the ones that are making the money off of it. All right. And then the definition of it, anytime it involves recruiting someone, harboring someone, giving them a place to stay, but you're kind of keeping them captive there and then they'll be trafficked from that place, transporting them, providing them, obtaining them, patronizing them. Patronizing means if someone is paying, so the Johns that come in that are paying for the sex, they can be prosecuted for trafficking as well. Patronizing or soliciting of a person. So if you're buying a person for the purpose of a commercial sex act, where the person is a U.S. citizen or a lawful permanent resident. And then when we talk about a child or a minor sex trafficking, it affects it if they are under the age of 18. Now, one key piece to keep in mind is if someone is over the age of 18, they can be trafficked too. Somebody over the age of 18 can be trafficked. It just means that legally, if they started being trafficked over the age of 18, then we have to be able to prove that they have experienced fraud, force, or coercion. Someone has forced them into this against their will. Someone has lied to them and manipulated them. A lot of times it starts out as hey, I care about you. They try to build a relationship with them, and they lie to them and get them into situations where Then they start expecting them to go out and make money in order for them to live. So then those are the things where it becomes a fraud, where they are lying to them about it being a sincere relationship. They're forcing them into it, they're coercing them, they're threatening either them or other people that they care about in order to keep them there. Okay, and we'll give a few examples later so you get an understanding of that. Sometimes when we say this part about if they're a U.S. citizen or a lawful permanent resident, they'll say, well, then what happens if they are an immigrant that doesn't have all of their documentation? Does that mean we won't help them or we don't have any protections for them? No, there are protections for them. This is illegal. It's illegal internationally, but there are protections for someone that's a non-documented immigrant would fall under different laws. Okay, so the Trafficking Victim of Protection Act is the one that protects U.S. citizens or lawful permanent residents. So let's talk for a minute. I'm going to let you all share your ideas about this one. What is the difference between a child or a teen prostitute or a victim of child sex trafficking? So I want you to just think for a minute about someone, if you hear that, oh, she's a teen prostitute or that's a child prostitute, how is it that, where would you expect to see them? How is it that you expect them to behave? How is it that they might be dressed? What kind of environment might you find them in if they're a child or a teen prostitute? Does this happen, child or teen prostitution?
Yes.
All right, it does. All right. So then if you think about that person, where might we find them? Where might they be?
I would think just like in the schools and stuff.
All right, could be right in the schools, it's possible, yep. All right, and then what would be like their demeanor, their behavior, their attitude about it, about what they're doing? Anything in particular?
They act more grown up.
All right, they
Are
may act,
angry a lot of the time.
all right, there could be anger involved in it, yeah, they act more grown up. They probably talk a little bit of a different language than a typical 15 or 16-year-old because they're exposed to a lot, right? All right, so then if you think about someone who's a victim of child sex trafficking, what is it that comes to mind? How do those two images compare, or what would make them different from one another? Any ideas?
I would think that sex trafficking, they probably don't even like go to school. They're probably like stuck in a prison like thing where there's maybe a bunch of them,
Okay.
and they can't, maybe like they're not even taught to talk or speak, right, or anything like that.
All right, yeah, and I think that's a very common, a common understanding that we have of child sex trafficking. Yeah.
I think with the child sex trafficking, their clothes would probably be better.
I think good.
Yeah, because
All
the
right.
other ones, they seem to, their clothes sometimes aren't very clean.
Okay, all right. Well, what's it? I'm sorry, Shira?
I wouldn't be able to tell the difference.
You wouldn't be able to tell the difference. All right, why do you say that? That's very insightful, so why do you say that?
Because these people know what they're doing, they don't want them to stand out.
Right.
They would dress them up the way everybody
Yeah.
else would be dressed.
They would look
because
just like
they
anybody
would
else.
look just like my child.
Mm-hmm.
And I
Alright.
think the sex trafficking ones don't really have conversations with you on the street, you know what I mean?
You wouldn't expect it. You wouldn't expect them to. I think that's our, and just like you were saying, we kind of have this idea in our heads that someone who is being a victim of child sex trafficking is chained up somewhere, they're isolated from people, like we don't see them, all right? And so we're gonna talk about how, this may look very different than what we have in our mind, but what I want you to remember about this slide in particular is that legally speaking, there is no such thing as a child or a teen prostitute, all right? Legally speaking, if someone is under the age of 18, even if they say to you, I'm choosing to do this. I'm out here because I want to be out here. I'm out here because I'm helping my family, pay the rent. Even if they say if they are under the age of 18, then by our laws, they are considered a victim of a crime, okay? And if we recognize that, then there are things we can do to put if a child at 15 or 16 feels like I have to be out on the streets making money to help my family pay rent, then there are things we can do to help that family get rent so that that child can be doing things a 15 or 16-year-old should be able to do, like go to school and get an education and build a life for themselves, all right? So, and a lot of times we will hear this term, because our culture is part of the problem. Because you'll hear this term on the media when they go, a child prostitute ring, a child prostitution ring in Pasadena, a child prostitution ring. Even the media uses this term. Instead of saying, there's no such thing as a child prostitute. These children that are in Ocean City that are being used this way are victims of child sex trafficking. So that's one of the things we do, is try to awaken people to this concept that, no, somebody under the age of 18 doesn't have the capacity to be able to make that choice and understand the long-term ramifications of it. We wouldn't let somebody at 15 or 16, we don't let them do other things out in the, we don't let them join the military, so why would we let them make a choice like this that would have such long-term consequences? Okay. So one of the common misconceptions that we hear is, if trafficking happens in the United States, there are a lot of people that just don't think this happens. We were talking with law enforcement in Hagerstown, Maryland, that said, we don't see this as a problem. And then there's a social worker in Hagerstown that said, I have 27 active cases of child sex trafficking on my desk right now. So you have both ends of the spectrum right there in the same small city in Maryland, where the social worker's going, I can show you this is happening right here in our town. And you've got law enforcement going, I don't think it's a problem here. So that's part of our challenge. But a lot of people will say, if it is happening in the United States, then it's foreign nationals. It's people that are being brought over here from other countries. And it does happen to people that are being brought over here from other countries. But the reality of it is that foreign-born victims in the United States are only a small percentage of our trafficking victims. The majority are U.S. citizens, and specifically children. We know about 38% of people that are being trafficked in the United States are children. All right. So if you look at this heat map, all right, this is the United States, and this is generated by phone calls to the National Human Trafficking Hotline. All right. So when they get a phone call and they have a case of human trafficking that's been identified, it heats up certain areas where those calls come out of and where those cases are identified. So when you see the red areas, those are the areas where the highest number of human trafficking cases are being reported. All right. So if you look over here where we are,
Because we have those two major highways.
that's
going
about
on
as
here.
dark a red as you can get. Yeah, we are a hot spot for human trafficking here. And the other thing, and you're right, we've got those highways, so the highways run up and down the coast. And so that's why you see that red up and down the coast. So you're picking up on an important part of it. So it's not that this doesn't happen. It does happen in the United States. And not only does it happen, but it happens a lot. The professionals that know this and that study it and that keep the stats on it say it happens not only in every state, it happens in every city in America if you choose to look for it. And some of the confusion about it is we need to understand if they're under the age of 18, they are a victim of child sex trafficking, whether they say that they are choosing to be there or not. It's actually estimated that more than 100,000 children a year are victims or at risk of becoming a victim of child sex trafficking. One of that is because we know that runaways are at a very high risk of being targeted by traffickers. And so one of the things that we try to speak into is that runaways, and when we see a report or we hear an Amber Alert that goes off, that's our first thought right away. This is a person that if we can't get them back in the first 48 hours, it's likely that they will be targeted by a trafficker in the first 48 hours. And we'll talk about some of the things that traffickers do specifically to be able to find them. In Maryland, child sex trafficking was not considered child abuse until 2012. It wasn't even considered. But in 2012, they amended the definition of child abuse so that it specifically included human trafficking of a child pornography, and prostitution of a child. So with this change, that was important legislation that not only did it allow us to start seeing and getting help for children, but it also gave them the opportunity when they were identified to get resources and get plugged into opportunities to be able to rebuild. And it also helped vacate their, it allowed them to start being seen as a victim instead of a criminal when they were. And rather than being arrested, there were people that thought in terms of, oh no, we need to help them. This is somebody that's a victim in this situation. So that was very important legislation. But the reality in Maryland is that even though it was not legally recognized as child abuse until 2012, within the first 2 years, there were 381 cases of child sex trafficking that were identified in Maryland. So by 2014. Now since then, between 2013 and 2017, we've had more than 200 cases of child sex trafficking that have been identified across 17 different counties in Maryland. So we know that it happens all over the state. Did you have a comment, or you swatting a fly? I know, I see him too. But when I have my glasses on, I can't see him, so he doesn't bother me as much. I can only see things really close. Most of those cases, the ones that have happened in the last 4 years, were Maryland residents. So once again, these are not foreign nationals that are being brought here. These are our own children, you know, our neighbors in our communities. And most of them were between the ages of 14 and 17. All right, so now we have a little video clip. This video clip is from a documentary. It's getting a little older now. I think it was from 2010 or 2011. The video is called Sex and Money. The whole documentary is pretty heavy stuff. We're going to do a little clip here that'll give you some insight to what the professionals are telling us, how this looks in the world around us. So let's see if I can get some places here.
Experts estimate that as many as 17 to 18,000 people are trafficked across international borders in the United States. But that is the minority of the trafficking that takes place here. The vast majority of trafficking is domestic trafficking, the trafficking of people who were born in the United States, who grew up in the United States. Most trafficking, human trafficking, is for the purposes of prostitution. The average age of entry into prostitution in the United States is 13 to 14. That means most people who end up in prostitution start out as children, actually start out as trafficked children.
It's now rated the third largest form of organized crime. They think it's a $10 billion business. It's preceded only by the sale of drugs and the sale of weapons. But unlike drugs and weapons, guns that can be sold once, a human body can be sold.
We learned that these kids really are slaves, that they can't walk away. We try to be very conservative. We try to only use numbers that we can defend and for which there's actual proof. We believe we can prove with a high degree of confidence that there are at least 100,000 American kids a year who are the victims of child prostitution and child marriage. These are runaways. These are kids who are preyed upon on the streets by people offering them shelter or comfort or love, who then find themselves trapped in a situation from which they can't escape. They become literally 21st century slaves.
June of 2007, I was in a meeting and the former vice mayor of Phoenix came in late and she had tears in her eyes and she started to tell us about this issue of child sex slavery. And I, like many people in the U.S., was shocked. I knew this happened in Cambodia and India, but I had no idea it was happening in our own city. And so I remember sitting in that meeting thinking, we have 10, 11, 12, 13, 14-year-old girls being raped for profit that night in our city.
Atlanta's finding around 300 kids a month. Dallas is finding around 200 or 300 kids a month who are in the sex trade. So if you look at major cities and you're seeing that volume, and you begin to spread that across the country, you begin to see higher and higher and higher numbers.
And in the United States, it doesn't just happen in New York, in Los Angeles, and Las Vegas. It's happening in small towns. It's happening in middle America. The only way not to find this problem in any city is simply not to look for it.
All right, yeah, that's what we said. The only way not to find this problem is not to look for it. So, let's talk about this. Adolescence. Why are our adolescents so vulnerable? How many of you know an adolescent? How many of you remember what it was like to be an adolescent? Yeah, right? And so, yeah. Yeah, either way, I'm going to use it again in a minute, but yes, the reality of it is we want it, and we will give you a list of things where we will say these are things that put kids at risk, and every child should be considered, vulnerable and at risk. It doesn't matter what family they were raised in, socioeconomics, where they went to school, none of that matters. Every child is at risk because this is what's common among every child, and this is what we have to keep in mind. When we talk about adolescent vulnerabilities, and I'm actually going to go to the next slide because these are duplicated, we have to talk about brain development, all right? So if this is the brain, this is our brain, this is like our spinal cord, so this is the front, the prefrontal area of our brain, all right? And the prefrontal cortex of our brain is critical because it is responsible for our ability to reason, to make informed decisions, to prioritize our thoughts, to anticipate consequences. And this part of our brain doesn't mature until we're in our early to mid-20s. Some people will say for men it never does, but that's a whole different thing. It doesn't mature until we're in our early to mid-20s, all right? Now the reality of it is that these are critical thinking skills that we have to have if we are going to be able to make decisions about our sexuality and engaging in this kind of behavior. But when you have a child that what was the average age they said somebody's first trafficked?
12?
Yeah,
14
13 or 14, yeah, 12, 13 or 14. Last year we said the average age was 13, now it's actually they are saying this year 13 to 14, so it is a little bit higher. We also have other statistics that are saying the most targeted demographic right now for trafficking is 7 to 9-year-old boys. So it's not just a thing that happens to girls. It's not just a thing that it's not just 13 and 14-year-olds. For every 18-year-old out there, there's a 9-year-old out there who's being trafficked in order for the average to be 14, okay? So, yes, but the average age is 14. So when you think about a 14-year-old, their brain has not developed yet in order for them to be able to make these types of important decisions or to process, problem solve, right? And when they're in a bad situation or a tough situation, their brain doesn't have the capacity to be able to figure their way out of it yet. In an ideal world, they would have their mom or their dad that they would go to and say, help me with this. What we know is we have a brokenness in our world where that's just not always the case, and so it puts kids at risk. But if we think in terms of our brain development, the prefrontal cortex is critical in what makes adolescents so vulnerable. And then you have this area called the hippocampus, and it's right in the middle of the brain, and the hippocampus is related to our emotions and our experiences that we have. And so when we have a really great experience, it kind of anchors in really positive memories. And so when that might be associated every time we go to the lake, I remember that time that our family went to the lake, it was so great, and we have positive memories. But when you have a traumatic event that happens in your life, and when we talk about child sex trafficking, it's hard to get more traumatic than that. So when you have a traumatic event, then it anchors very hard, very difficult emotions into that part of our brain. And then you have the amygdala, which is attached to the hippocampus. And when you have those really heavy emotional things in the hippocampus, the amygdala is what kind of regulates our thinking about ourselves, and it generalizes our thinking to other events and things. So when you have a child who's been trafficked and their trafficker tells them, this is who you are now, you're worthless, no one's ever going to care, this is who you're always going to be, then for a child, because of their brain development, they very quickly will go, if I'm worthless now, then I will always be worthless. They will generalize that to mean for my whole life, this is what it's gonna be like. So they actually lose the ability to even think that there is something better out there for them, because their brain kind of shuts down at that stage when they're going through that really hard stuff, all right? So then you think, well, when you add to that, all this stuff in the prefrontal cortex that's supposed to be happening that doesn't even mature until they're in the early to mid-20s, it actually we kind of describe it like this. So if this is your brain, and this is your brain stem, your development happens and you mature from the back of the brain to the front. So the prefrontal cortex is the very last part that develops and matures. So when you have that traumatic event that happens in the middle, it kind of flips the brain. It twists the wiring around. It shuts down that prefrontal cortex. And until that child gets the opportunity to get the restorative services that they need, they will never be able to think in those terms. They will never develop that capacity to problem solve well and to think through consequences of their actions. And so that's one of the things that's beautiful about the restorative services that the well provides, because that is one of the things that Mandy and the staff and the volunteers here work so hard to do, is to be able to walk with people to say, hey, you know, this was tough, this is hard, you've been through some really hard things, but we know this is who God says that you are. And this is where we want you to understand. This is where your value and worth is. So even if we get those things locked into our brain that say differently, we have to be willing to go, all right, there's more to it than what I may have heard at that time or what I may have experienced. And so for these young people that are being trafficked, that's kind of where they get stuck. And we will have young survivors that will come out of a situation and they will start moving toward their restoration, and you will see them in a setting and they want to suck their thumb, or they want to sit and watch cartoons with 7- and 8-year-olds, because mentally they need to go back and process and become that and work through that trauma to be able to move forward and allow their brain to mature in the way that it always was created to do. All right. So this brain, these adolescent brains are part of the risk. Then when you add to that their puberty and all the changes we go through in puberty and how hard it is in society when you go from elementary school to middle school, and there's all that comparison and where do I fit in, and my friends are different now, and now those friends have moved on and I don't really fit in. When you start thinking about all the things that 13 and 14-year-olds are trying to deal with in their lives, then you start realizing these are the things. Not that traffickers understand the adolescent brain, they are not biophysicists, but they do understand when a child is demonstrating like a need for something, and when they need affirmation from somebody, a trafficker will pick up on that. When they need to connect with people, a trafficker will pick up on that. And so traffickers really are keen at figuring out what it is a child needs and trying to provide that in order to make that connection to them. And that's a lot. That's really a very brief version, but I know there's a lot to that. So are any questions that raises for anybody, or?
I can stop the video if you guys need to talk for a moment. Need me to stop it? Anybody need to want to process?
Does it make sense? Did I break it down enough? Because sometimes we make it really complicated.
I have
And
a
I'm like,
question.
well, that was confusing for me. Yeah.
So if you go through something traumatic, right?
Mhm.
Your brain tries to help you out by like trying to like not cover it up, but try to
Suppress it.
suppress it.
Yep, absolutely.
And if you do not get that traumatic situation, you'll always have that. You
Yep.
won't be able, as you know, when you go through like a sexual abuse, then
Absolutely.
you still deal with that.
Yep. On some level, you're still going to be dealing with that, yes.
And until you like talk about it, you know, you'll still be stuck somewhere between when it happened, like
Yep.
if you're 13, 14, something like that.
Absolutely.
You'll still have, oh, okay.
And there are people that will say, and I'm reading a book right now that's really fascinating about this, but they will say what you will do is you will put yourself back in situations that might even put yourself at risk, trying to have it to work through that trauma so that it will end differently this time. Because there is something subconsciously that you know that you need to deal with, but we don't have the tools to do that on our own. So it's really important that first you acknowledge it, you recognize Yeah, this is something. And sometimes we suppress it to the point that we go, I didn't even remember that happening in my life until this, and this was put into place. And then all of a sudden that sparked a memory for me, and I go, oh, I remember, yeah, when I was 7, and that thing happened, and I didn't pay that much attention to it, but it was a turning point for me. But yeah, if you don't deal with it, you're going to, usually what will happen is you'll act out on it in some way. Even if that means you do things that are self-harming, to try to deal with it, yeah. And that could be different for everybody, it can look different for everybody.
Laura, I wanted to add, I think it's a good time to say that we are going to be having a trauma therapy session for, like, it's a 6-week session, so I know some of you work, but it would be a great thing to be able to come to. We're actually gonna require it for all of our mentees at this point, and it's gonna be, it'll be counted as your volunteer time, and that's gonna be on Wednesdays. It will be an additional class for like a month, but it'll be on Wednesdays. I think it's a 4-week session, and it's gonna be really good. Jessica Randall, do you guys remember Jessica? Who used to do our resources? She's gonna be heading that up and giving us the opportunity to heal and to have like this like little support group here at the well for our traumas. So, and she'll let you know, because she is a certified social worker, she will let you know what it is you can talk about and what it is, the things that you can say and the things that you should not say to her. So she'll make those things extraordinarily clear when we all get started. And you don't have to say anything. If you just choose to not say anything, that's fine. I'd rather just have you sitting and listening, because it may not be your time yet to talk about it, that's fine. But like Laura's saying, it's either gonna come out now or it's gonna come out later, or in some other different way. So it's good to be healed from these horrible things.
Absolutely.
So. Hey, anybody know why we're, I mean, obviously, I think it's obvious, but do we know why we're having a sex trafficking conversation here at the well? Why we find that to be so important during our Community Concerns Month?
Because it's in our community.
Yeah.
We see it every day. I see it every day. I know
Every
some of the
day,
women. I
yeah.
see it every day, and you know these things because I have children. And anything that happens, you got to be aware because it is people out here that do want your child.
It's terrifying
They-
too,
yeah.
like when you think about two like young kids, like when they grow up, it's kind of just I want to hug them and never let them go.
Yeah.
But yeah, it is terrifying to realize that
And this is
it's
helpful.
so much going on.
Yep. Yeah, it can be, but I think part of that empowerment is the more you know about it, the more you know what to look for, then the better we can put those parameter boundaries in place, or talk to your kids in appropriate ways to say, this is why I don't want you to get in that car with someone. This is why I
So
tell
they
you
can
that it's important
understand
that in the store you stay right
I'm
next to me
having
and
to
you
come
don't wander off. This is why, all of those things, because we don't want our children to grow up fearful of everything, but we want them aware enough to protect themselves and to make smart choices. Yeah, so good. All right. Thanks, ladies. This is good. All right, we do have another video clip. This one is a little bit more insight about what they see from the trafficker standpoint and how the traffickers act in order to find their targets and target their victims.
Now, all of your research, what would you say is like the main source of problem in these girls' lives? Would you point to for family or sexual abuse in the home, all of the above? What would be the main source?
The main problem is that they've been abandoned. Their family has broken down and they've run away from something and they've run into the arms of these predatory pimps and people who abuse them and abuse them.
They are products of in-house molestation. They are products of being subjected to domestic violence in the house. They are products of having parents who are really
We found that there were girls across the spectrum, but if they've been sexually abused in any family, in any way, they had already decided they were bad. Even if they didn't do anything, there is an assignment of the female to herself of being bad.
When a young person, but in this case a young woman, is in the tender formative years and they are abused, their psyche forms around that abuse. And if it's sexual abuse,
then they kind of learn that relationship includes being victimized sexually.
So we have a 12-year-old that's running away from a home environment, maybe where she's been groomed for prostitution. Uncle Joe's coming over and touching and patting and giving her ice cream money. She ends up running away from home. You know, there's plenty of predators out there looking to exploit these young girls, as well as there's plenty of men out there willing to buy them. You know, and that's a sad situation.
Said that there's 1.7 million runaways in the United States. Why do you think that number is so high?
Most kids who are running away are not running to something, they're running away from something. And one of the big challenges that we face is that only about a quarter to a third of those kids are even reported missing by their parents. So in the latest Justice Department research, they talk about two categories: runaway kids and throwaway kids. So a significant segment of that population are truly the new American homeless.
So actually, I think people are surprised. They don't really understand quite the connection between homelessness and prostitution. But we know that so many of the women involved in sex trade are doing it out of survival.
There's this theory called drift theory, that it just sort of slowly happens to people. That you do something a little bit, someone gives you $20, you're like, oh, well, I can go eat on this, and then you sort of drift into it. It's not something that you walk out of your house and you say, this is exactly what I want to do with my life.
And it always was this sort of sad story of defenses slowly being broken down and you know, being with someone who asked you to do something and things you never imagined that you would do, and all of a sudden you're there.
Yeah, so increased risk factors, what it is, the things that really puts a child at risk are marginalization. So they kind of feel like they're already disconnected. They have a broken family, broken community. At Araminta we say, you know, this happens because of broken community. And we believe that that restoration, that healing will happen in the context of a healthy community dynamic. But when a child feels marginalized, less than, and they gave some other things. They said when there is a history of sexual abuse already, statistically, a child that has a previous history of sexual abuse is 11 times more likely to become a victim of child sex trafficking. And 93% of the women who were restored out of a sex trafficking situation reported that they had been sexually abused as a child. So that sexual abuse as a child, especially if we don't deal with it, you know, that is something a child, unfortunately, what were our numbers? 1 in 4 girls, 1 in 6 boys. So if all of those kids aren't coming forward and talking about the experience, a lot of times they internalize it and blame themselves. And because of that, then it changes something in their belief. Remember that amygdala where they go, well, that's who I am now. And it takes them down this path where it puts them at greater risk of being targeted and victimized again as they get older. Homelessness and chronic runaways. We know the longer that they are out on the streets, generally traffickers will identify them in the first 48 hours. They will already have had some kind of interaction with the trafficker. And so somebody that's homeless on the streets and 14 or 15 years old, they don't have a lot of good opportunities for making money and buying their own meals and putting a roof over their heads. So a trafficker comes along and says, hey, I can give you a place to stay. And they don't really even understand what they're, you know, they think, oh, there's somebody that wants to be friends with me. That's so nice. And then it builds from there. We know that a history of foster care or exposure to juvenile services puts a child at risk. They're disconnected from family. Even in the foster system, there are great foster homes out there. There are also foster homes that are far below what we would want for every child to get to experience. And because of that, they, even in their foster homes, they don't have that connection, that bond to the adults in that home. A lot of times they will run away from their foster situation, so that puts them at risk. If they identify as LGBTQ, sometimes in their own home, their parents aren't okay with that. So that leads them into situations where they will run away or feel like they got thrown out of their home. So that puts them at risk. Drug and alcohol use, sometimes that comes before they get trafficked. Sometimes it comes as a result of their trafficking, but we know that this is a risk factor. And then there is a gang component to this. We know that there are gangs that will take young people and traffic kids their own age to make money for the gang. They will also use these children and trade them to other gangs if there is some type of real or perceived debt that they owe to the other gang. And so kids are being used as a commodity, something they can barter with or trade off. So imagine in the mind of that 13 or 14-year-old what it would feel like to be given away by somebody. So what are some of the things that might indicate trafficking? We know that there are kids that are sitting in our schools that are being trafficked. All right, and that this happens in different ways. We know that there's a thing called familial traffic, where it's a parent or an uncle or the boyfriend of an older sibling that is trafficking the younger sibling. We have cases of each one of those that we deal with. So somebody in our schools, we know that there are kids that are sitting in our schools that are being trafficked. Truancy, if they miss a lot of school, if they miss a lot of Fridays and Mondays or Thursdays and Fridays, because traffickers will take them out of state, up and down that highway, to move them to other places, to traffic them for the weekend, especially if there's a big sporting event or a convention somewhere, that's where they will move them to, because that's where opportunity is. If they have a boyfriend who is noticeably older, it's a very common thing that we see, because the traffickers, even though traffickers can be younger and closer to their age, typically it's going to be somebody that comes and picks them up at school that's quite a bit older than they are, or that they're seen around town with somebody that's quite a bit older. And so pay attention to those kind of things. If they have bruises or experience physical trauma, that can be an indicator. If they all of a sudden have a change in the way that they dress, in their behavior, or their material possessions. Oh, they got that new iPhone. How'd they get that phone? They can't afford that. They're getting their nails done now. They're wearing really nice clothes. How do they have the money to do all of that? Their family doesn't have those kind of resources, so why did that change all of a sudden? Pay attention to those kinds of things. Sometimes they will carry two phones, because they will have one that their friends can call them on, and they have the other one that they have to always have turned on, because their traffickers should be able to reach them anytime, day or night. Signs of drug addiction can be. If they've had, and this is one of the things we tell to nurses in the schools and when we do our professional trainings, multiple STDs is a reportable thing, because this is something that, especially for a child, a minor, we need to be paying attention to. And they're labeled fast by their peers. Typically, they will be hypersexual. As we said earlier, they will talk in a language that not the typical 14 or 15-year-old will, although in our culture, because of music and movies and things, kids today are exposed to a lot more. But they will be more outspoken about it. They will just talk. They will say it. They will talk about adult websites and things where the typical kid in a school isn't going to feel that, that they can be that outspoken about it. And then they have tattoos or brandings. Now, this is something that, hey, a lot of people have tattoos anymore, this in and of itself. Tattoos and brandings by the trafficker are intended to mark them as property, as ownership, and it's intended to be a permanent reminder to this individual. Remember, brain development has already kind of told them, this is who I am now. But traffickers are very intentional about trying to reinforce that all the time. They will tattoo the necks, they will tattoo in areas that it wouldn't be easy for them to always cover it up. These are examples that we have seen in the Baltimore and DC area. You've got money maker, money over everything, daddy's girl, that reference to the familial thing like daddy. There's a lady that I know that works for the Department of Justice that say they just had a young 15-year-old girl, and across her low back she had ATM tattooed on her low back. So for her, that's all she was an easy way to get money for her trafficker. But those are very intentional things that traffickers do to try to kind of be a permanent thing. Now, we also know the beauty of this is there are nonprofits that work very hard to provide services for women to either remove their tattoos or to be able to put them, recreate them in a way that is more of who we know them to be and the beauty that they possess in God's eyes. Some of the language, I won't spend a lot of time on this, but they talk about the life or the game, the buyer or the John. Men named John kind of get offended by that. They're like, hey, we're not all that bad, but that just kind of was a given because it's such a common name, and so people think of it in terms of it's such a common thing that happens, unfortunately. Pimp, trafficker, or daddy is very common language that's used. They do use a lot of family terminology. So the other girls that are working for that trafficker would be called the stable sisters. The bottom girl is sometimes referred to as the wifey or the wife-in-law. The bottom girl would be someone that the trafficker uses to keep an eye on all the other girls. And if they act out or if they do something that's out of line, then she would report back to the trafficker, and that gives her some level of security or protection with her trafficker. If somebody acts out and she doesn't report back, then that's when she would get in trouble. The track is just the area that they're working. Quota is how much money they should bring in the night or how many interactions they have in the night. Our FBI resource partners tell us that the average for an underage victim of sex trafficking is 10 to 15 buyers a night. So over the course of the year, you're talking more than 3,600 rapes that that child would be exposed to. So when we talk in terms of trauma, we're talking a lot of trauma, repetitive trauma. Turning out is, you know, they will find a young person, they will bond with them, they will offer them a place to stay, they'll bring them into the family, and then they will turn them out onto the streets. I just heard a story, actually it's a well-known case, Holly Smith. She was trafficked in New Jersey. She met a guy online, she was 14. He started, you know, just really pursuing her as her boyfriend. And she ran away with him after a few weeks, and out on the streets for a few weeks he took her to New Jersey and then said, tonight you're going to go out and you're going to work the streets for me. So he turned her out onto the streets, and somebody that was interviewing her said, how did you feel the first night that he put you out on the streets and said, you're going to sell yourself to men? And she responded, surprisingly to everyone, well, actually I felt empowered. And they said, well, do you mean like he groomed you to think that way? Like he taught you to think that way? And she said, well, no, actually, society groomed me to believe that that's what women were made for long before I met my trafficker. So when I met my trafficker, he just picked up from there. So when he turned me out onto the streets, that first night I thought, wow, how stupid all these men are, that they're willing to pay me to have sex with me. That's how much, as a 14-year-old, society had told her, women are here just to have sex. Now the interesting thing is, she said, but 24 hours later, she said she thought she was empowered that first night. 24 hours later, she said, I realized my trafficker had all the power because he raped me. And so for her, that's how quick, like in her mind, she realized, no, I don't have any of the power here. Out of pocket is when a young victim is acting out. They want to break away from it, and so they're considered out of pocket. This puts them at risk with their trafficker and other traffickers, because if they get hold of them, they would be physically at risk. They would beat them up, they will threaten them. So out of pocket is a risky terminology, but that's the way that they would be referred to. A square is anybody that doesn't understand the life or that isn't in the life. And for those of us at Araminta, we believe that it is God's call on us to move forward on this issue, because, as I mentioned earlier, we consider these modern-day slaves. And he tells us in Isaiah, he has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives. And that's what these victims are. And release from darkness for the prisoners, to comfort all who mourn and provide for those who grieve in Zion. To bestow on them a crown of beauty instead of ashes, the oil of joy instead of mourning, and a garment of praise instead of a spirit of despair. So, I'm going to just pause right there. Any questions about any of the other things that we covered as far as the trafficking itself?
No questions, guys?
It's a lot to process, I get that, so I mean.
Well, it's heavy, this is a heavy subject.
It's a lot, there's a lot to it.
Yeah.
And
And you guys can share personal experiences. I know, I understand that some of us have actually been in these shoes. So if anybody wants to open up, feel free to, but it's not required, for sure.
When I was in the shelter, I just had Shania, and I was running from her father, and I was saying it's called Gabriel Projects out in Lincoln City. I met this lady, her name was Jordan, and she was like 2 years older than me, and she just had a baby, and she was in sex trafficking. I'll never forget it. She was running from them. She had a book with like congressmen that she was about to blow the whistle, like she had a lawyer and everything. And 2 months before she was being released to go back, they was moving her to another state. They said she jumped out the second story window, which we all know is not true.
Yeah.
She was trafficked. That she had names. She always told me, be careful out, you know, because never trust men. Like she had a baby, and like she was running from, like she was in it since she was little. She said in middle America there are families who have children just to put them in sex trafficking. I don't know if that's true or not, but I remember the conversations that we had, and it's real. It's real, and she had a book, and she was gonna like, I don't know, tell or something. 2 months before
That everything was gonna move
that
forward.
everything that was gonna move forward, they were hiding her at the shelter, Gabriel Projects. They said she jumped up the second story.
And I think too, that speaks to the depth that we will go to cover up our own sin. You know, and we know that it happens in our world. And when somebody feels like, oh, I'm being threatened or I'm gonna be exposed and people are gonna know, especially when you have somebody with power. And unfortunately, that is one of the things that we see, is when you have someone that has money and resources, then in our culture that translates a lot of times as powerful people. And they have people that will work on their behalf because they have money and resources, and so they're perceived as powerful. And they, you know, that they would go to that extreme to hide their sin. You know, and what that does is that reminds me of David in the Old Testament, because when he had the affair with Bathsheba, and then Bathsheba came back to him and said, well, I'm pregnant, he thought he could hide it. If her husband would just come home from the war and sleep with her, then they would just play it off that way. But her husband was such a devoted soldier, he didn't want to. He came home, but he just slept on the ground outside the king's gate rather than go to sleep with his wife, because he felt an obligation to be back out there with the other men that were fighting on the king's behalf. And so when he went back out to the war, David sent him out with a letter for his commander that said, put Uriah on the front line of the battle and then retreat so that he gets killed. So David had this man killed rather than confess to his own sin. So that's what these people are doing, is, you know, they would rather have this woman killed.
Is that true though? Like, is it like Congress people that's involved?
I think that this is an issue that, especially when we talk about the brokenness of sexual sin, I don't know that there is any career path or any person that is exempt from it. I think that it happens on all levels. I do know there's a lady, Bonnie Martin, that works on trauma-informed recovery. She's a very well-respected counselor and psychologist that lives in Virginia, but she does counseling for people and that struggle with sexual sin and sexual addiction. And when she was doing our trauma-based training, she said, I cannot even begin to tell you how many of my clients are on Capitol Hill. So does it happen? Yes, it happens. And I think that it would be naive of us to think that it couldn't happen. You know, this is one of those cases where you go, opportunity, money, you know, they've got enough people that will work on their behalf. And then the other part of it is, as a culture, we play a role in it as well, because we sexualize everything that we do. And we raise young girls to think, honestly, I'm going to try not to get too political or not, but when, and I know this, I'm too old, I'm older than most of you in here, so when you have a young intern like Monica Lewinsky, who's what, 23 or whatever, working in the White House, and she will have sex with Bill Clinton because he's the president, and you go, he wasn't this good looking, can't resist him kind of guy, but he had power and he had money, and so there's something in the minds of young women that go, that's okay. And I know women myself who are fine having, you know, inappropriate relationships with married men. They don't worry about it, you know, it's just all fun and games for them. So I think as a culture, on the one end of it, we go, men are gonna do what men are gonna do, and we kind of excuse that, and then on the other end of it, we go, as women, we go, well, then I'm gonna get whatever I wanna get out of it and not worry about it either. So we kind of play into the problem, some. But I don't think there's anybody who's exempt from this issue. No.
So what do you do if maybe you think of a kid around here is being like,
Yeah.
what do you do? Do you go to, you talk to them? Do you go to, what do you do?
I think one of the best things that we could do is, remember that marginalization piece? They don't feel connected to anybody. If you are that trusted adult, then build an appropriate relationship with them. You know, pour into them. Welcome them into your, you know, your home or with your kids, and in healthy ways, and give them a connection to something that is a better option. There may be a point where they will speak out and share something with you that you maybe suspected. They may never decide, but you're giving them an option. And then, yeah, I probably would go to, if you know what their home situation is like, if you think their home is part of the problem, I think then you have to take other routes. If you think a child is being trafficked, then you could call the National Human Trafficking Hotline, and you don't have to give any of your own personal information. You just tell what you know about that case. And then they will pursue the case to see, is there something else to this, whether that's a child in the schools, whether that's a child that's, you know, that you know through some other resource. But the National Human Trafficking Hotline is generally, you know, if you think it's that kind of thing. If you think a kid is potentially being sexually abused, then the hotline wouldn't be the, you know, they won't pursue cases like that, but then it would be something where you would have to go through the school system probably and report it, that your concerns to the school, and let the school start the social, you know, the social workers and counselors in the school would pursue it from that side. But I know that in those situations too, you know, our social workers are gonna, you know, they're very overworked in some places. But I think that once you know about this issue, for us to sit and do nothing almost gives us part of the burden of it. Like if this is a situation where someone's being put at risk, a young person's being put at risk, and I sit back and say nothing, then I'm part of the problem. So you do have to put the right things in order and speak out on it. And then if you had a case too, I know, you know, you've got resources here. Those of us at Araminta, if it's a, you know, if there's something that we can do to kind of talk through it with you, then we're always open to that as well.
Yeah, I think it's crazy how like so much of it can happen, and you think like in the video it showed like a really young girl in the window. You think somebody would pass by and be like,
Yeah.
what are you doing
Exactly.
there? Or that like the places where they know that it's happening and that the traffickers are trying to hide it or whatever,
Yep.
like in these ghetto areas, like where nobody comes down except for shady
Sure.
people, that it would be like patrolled like better by the cops or something. Like it's just crazy that so much of it goes on.
Yeah, and I do think it speaks to that brokenness kind of permeating everything. We know, unfortunately, you know, in Baltimore City, we have our police department at the end of the 2 city blocks of strip clubs and places where this goes on all the time. It's not that they don't know that it goes on, and we've had cases where we've had young girls that are going through our services that said, oh, every time I got arrested, they would have sex with me before they would book me. Every time I got picked up, that would be part of it. So the police department can be part of the problem. Now, it doesn't mean that every police officer would, but they can be part of the problem. The task force that we're
And it could be
working.
that they were looking to arrest.
Absolutely.
because- So that's the.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah.
So, yeah, they're looking for it. You know, just like the case that we're working with in Hagerstown right now, where you have the law enforcement that go, it's not a problem, it's not a problem. You know, for us, when we work in this field enough, it raises concerns for us that this is a person that doesn't want to deal with the problem. Because they would rather us look the other way for a reason. All right. So it's just it permeates every walk of life. And I think that the other big challenge is not to let it skew you and go, it's everybody. It is not everybody. But there is a brokenness that exists, and I think that our world has it's been a cumulative thing over the last several decades. Back in the 1970s, we had eradicated child pornography. It was just not an easy process for somebody to put pictures out there, but then because of the internet, it is a booming industry. It's one of the most searched topics on the internet is child pornography. So, and so when you have that much profit that people are making on it, I'm sorry, it's bad, but money speaks. And that's what in the Bible when it tells us the love of money, when you love money enough that you're willing to subject a young person to this because it will line your pockets and make you richer, then there's a depth of sin to that God sees, and that you cannot get by with. That has to be addressed. But it happens, and so now child pornography is such a booming business. So I have a few more slides here I want to make sure, but if anybody else has comments or questions, please ask. Araminta, we work to awaken, equip, and mobilize the church and our community in Maryland to end this issue through education, prevention strategies, and restorative survivor services. Our goal is that traffickers will say, we cannot do business in Maryland anymore because the people there just will not allow it. So the more that we can awaken people to this issue, the more that people will speak up when they see something, then it's our hope that this will someday be eradicated in our community and across our state. And then we do have the privilege of walking with these young people that move from bondage, that bondage and those chains that hold them captive to what they were told when they were being victimized by their traffickers, and now we can see them on the other side of it. So that's part of the beauty of the work that we get to do. A very well-known church leader and author said, there is nothing like the local church when it's working right. Its beauty is indescribable, its power is breathtaking, its potential is unlimited. It comforts the grieving and heals the broken. Whatever the capacity for human suffering, and we know people that are caught up in child sex trafficking are suffering. The church has a greater capacity for healing and wholeness. Still to this day, the potential of the local church is almost more than I can grasp. No other organization on earth is like the church. Nothing even comes close. So we believe that it is Christ's call on the church to work toward wholeness and healing for those who have been exploited through this issue. And then these are all of the different businesses and community groups and members that we feel like can play a role in addressing. It can't just be law enforcement. It can't just be the schools. It can't just be our local community, our faith community. It has to be all of us working together. And the beauty of that is we have people from our businesses and our schools and our law enforcement and our government that are all in our faith community, which is why we think the church and our places of faith are a great place to start arguing on behalf of this issue. And then these are some resources for parents. If you're interested in how to protect your kids, then those are just some of the parent resources that we offer. So, any other questions?
I got a question.
Yep.
So, last time you guys had this, I talked to my kids about it, and my son said, Mom, they just do it, they just take girls. And I'm like, no, they take boys and girls. So is there like some information that I can show him?
Yeah, statistically, about 82% from the ones of the cases that we know, about 82% are female of the child victims. So that's about 18% that are boys. So they do take boys. Like I mentioned earlier, during our most recent training that we had, the fastest growing demographic is boys between the ages of 7 and 9. So traffickers are targeting boys between the ages of 7 and 9. So I think that even though, and I think that sometimes for boys it gives them a sense of like, shoot, it's not going to be me.
Yeah.
But I think it's an important issue to address with them because it may not be them that is trafficked, but boy, they could sure speak into the heart of one of the young girls at their school if they saw somebody at risk. Araminta has a partnership with the Maryland State Department of Education where we have gone out into the school, middle and high schools in Baltimore City, Baltimore County, and Prince George's County to train the administration and staff on how to recognize students in their building So over the next year and a half, we want to be able to train the students as well on how to recognize this, how to avoid it, and how to protect the people that you care about from this issue. So the more that we do that, the more we can speak into it. It's not just a girls' issue. At Araminta, they started by providing services just for girls, but this is an area that we are expanding, and we want to be able to provide services for the young boys because we know it is such an issue. The other thing that happens for the young boys is it gets tied into the LGBTQ community so much, and so boys will mistakenly think, well, that's not me, so I wouldn't be at risk. But the traffickers don't care about that. They would subject them to whatever it is the demand is looking for. And so we know that is an issue. So, and then depending on what school he is in, how old is your son?
11.
He's 11, okay. So he's right on the front end of it, edge of it. Generally, our trainings are 12-year-olds and up. But there's a possibility that his school would be getting training on it. That is part of the most recent legislation is this has to be incorporated into their health and safety trainings in the schools. But we don't know how much emphasis they will put on it because they have to include it with all of the other things in their curriculum they have to throw in. So it could be 2 sentences, or it could be somebody that comes in
And
and
I've
does the day training.
introduced the training from even the Maryland Coalition to Benjamin Franklin High School. I don't think they did anything with it. But it would be nice if we could bring it here to Restoration even
Absolutely.
to train, yeah.
Absolutely. Yep. Any other comments, questions? You've been a wonderful audience, ladies.
Any concerns, ladies?
Yeah.
Anybody see some common things that they might be able to look back and go, oh my goodness, I was right there at this place in my life. I could have been swept away, or I was swept away.
Sure. You don't realize how quickly you
Yeah.
can hit really close to home.
Yeah.
Do you feel more prepared if you were to see something to go,
I can
oh
look
yeah, I
back
can
and look
speak
at
to that
times that
issue?
somebody had tried to burn me.
Yep.
Yeah, I was right in my family's house having a birthday party at my family's house for one of my cousins in New Jersey. And this guy, the neighbor, was coming, and I was sitting down in the living room by myself eating some ice cream because they just had cut the birthday cake and stuff. And he comes over with a baby and tries to I don't understand what he's saying because he's Hispanic and speaking broken English. I'm like, what are you saying? I'm wearing these shorts too, and he's like, oh, I like your shorts and stuff like that. He was trying to hit on me, and I didn't realize at the time. I felt it that I was there was a point where I was I'm scared of this guy. I need to leave. And if I wasn't with my family, that I could go on.
That's true. That's true. So that was a layer of protection that you had in place.
Yeah, I went straight to my dad and hid behind my dad.
Yeah, good for you.
So I knew, I felt something was off.
Right.
I'm out of here.
Yeah, and we know that in the malls, people that take their kids to the mall and drop them off, and that, young girls and young boys, can, especially if they are seen kind of alone or isolated from the rest of their groups of peers, somebody will approach them. They've had people that have approached and said, wow, your makeup looks great. Have you ever thought about modeling? I'd love to take some pictures of you. And you get a 14-year-old girl that somebody thinks they're pretty enough to be a model, and they go, oh yeah, I would love that. And they would walk right out with them.
I got that too. Right? I had someone try to give me a card for a model. I was like,
Yeah.
oh, you're so beautiful. You should be a model. But by that time, I was old enough. I'm like,
right, I'm not falling for this.
Yeah.
But you see how quickly a young girl that feels already disconnected or devalued, or my family doesn't care about me, and all of a sudden somebody shows enough interest in them, they're going to go, oh, well, they noticed me. So yeah, I'm interested. This works for me. This is what I've been looking for. That's what traffickers kind of build on. The internet and kids that have Instagram and Facebook, if they are public access, then traffickers peruse those, and they look for a kid that's posting sad pictures, or I hate my life, or oh, I'm so bored, and they strike up a conversation and go, oh, you're too pretty to be home by yourself on a Friday night. I have a friend in Bel Air. She has an 11-year-old granddaughter who made a fake Facebook account. So her granddaughter is doing something she's told her she's not allowed to do. Made a fake Facebook account saying she was 16. So then she meets a boy that says he's 18 and wants her to come out and meet with him. And so she hadn't done it yet, but my friend, the grandmother, comes across her Facebook account and says, what's going on here? And so then she said, she started interacting with the guy and saying, Well, my parents don't let me go out and meet my friends out until they've met them. Do you want to come to my house? And he was like, oh, parents don't understand. You know, parents would never understand. So he wasn't interested in that. But he ended up being 29 when they were able to get more information about him. So when you have a 29-year-old that's meeting up with an 11-year-old on Facebook, there's no good reason that you'd be looking for an 11-year-old, you know. And her pictures, she doesn't look 16, she looks 11. So, but for her, she was like, ooh, I feel grown up. There's this boy that's interested in me, you know. For her, it's building this thing in her that in our culture we say, well, you better find a boyfriend. Oh, you're 11, you don't have a boyfriend yet? You better get busy, you know. And so we've got to do better raising our young girls to realize that their value is not in what some man says about them, that their value is their God-given value, you know, and what he says about them. And so that they would have enough of their self-assurance to be able to pick up on these things and resist those temptations, because they're going to be out there. They're going to be faced with them.
I've seen stuff on Facebook about the Marley station,
Mhm.
mall. They've been having trouble down there.
Yeah.
You've heard that too?
Yep,
Okay, because I
absolutely.
just saw another post last night where somebody was trying to get a
Yeah.
girl that worked there.
I think I probably saw the same post.
Mm-hmm.
It was like and somebody was talking about Busters and Daves or something, some posted Busters
Yeah,
and Daves.
yes, that's the one it was
Yeah.
about. And the girl told her that she was pissing,
Right,
her
yes,
off.
yes. She made her go inside instead of getting in her car.
Yeah,
Yeah.
she didn't want to get in the car with
Yeah.
the girl.
Crazy stuff. Well, ladies, we gotta get out of here because people gotta get home by 2:30, is that right? But thank you so much for being such a great audience. I am around, so if I can ever answer any questions for you, please feel free to ask.
Don't forget about our trauma therapy.
There you
up
go.
front.
There you go.
Talk up front about it.
Oh, I don't know.
They should get double extra credit for that long class.